Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is still Saturday. Earlier we talked about Shadowrun. The video that we're going to alternate with Shadowrun is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now that's the second edition of Dungeons & Dragons that came out. I felt that that was a good place to start with. The first edition is fun. I've tried it. It's not bad. I have materials for it. It's just very difficult to play, and it had less options at the time. I'll kind of go over a little bit of why, and you sort of get an idea. But Advanced Dungeons & Dragons pushed it to a new level, and they actually had it out long enough that they had a second edition where they revised some things. Almost like a 2.5, though they never called it that. That's a little joke on the third edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which they had a revised called 3.5, where they actually called it that. So, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's a D20 system, and it's very similar to all the others. So what I want to do when I'm talking about it is I'm going to go over making your ability scores, and I'm also going to talk about the major concept, which is different than 5th edition, which I've talked about. And this is a big concept. A lot of the things are similar, but it also cuts out a lot of details that 5th edition and Pathfinder have. And you can see that this is sort of an opening gambit, if you will, to these systems. It's a precursor of it. So it's not as reformed, a little more confusing, but it's not bad. So what this system had is it worked armor class differently and how you attacked differently. Armor class started at 10, and things you would gain, like armor and shields, would give you negatives to that number. And you could go to 0 or below. You could fight things with negatives that were pretty big. And that's kind of a little confusing, and it matches a score called THACO. It means to hit armor class of 0. That means it's the number you have to roll to hit someone if they've got an armor class of 0. So if your THACO is 20, I'd have to roll a 20 to hit a 0. I'd have to roll a 10 to hit a 10. If my THACO is 18, roll an 18 to hit a 0, 8 to hit a 10, and so forth. Which means I would need a roll of 20 to hit a -2. Now, you oftentimes can get bonuses to that number through magic weapons, high strength, special abilities, that you can add bonuses when you're rolling for your THACO. That can happen. But it was like an interesting score, and fighters had their THACO go down quicker than other classes. Like wizards were very slow, rogues were in the middle, clerics were sort of around the same as rogues, and your THACO would get smaller and smaller and smaller, making it easier and easier and easier to hit 0 and below it. It's a little weird and confusing, but it's also a very interesting system that they had this minus to AC, and that's actually the same sort of system they used in 1st edition. It was a negative AC, that your AC started at 10 and got lower. Granted, they had different systems for attacks, and I will probably talk about it at some point in time, but not today. So let's talk about choosing your ability scores in 2nd edition, in AD&D, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I'll call it AD&D from now on. So they actually gave 6 ways that you could choose your ability scores. So you've got your 6 ability scores. The first thing they had is roll 3d6, go straight down the line. That was the first option your game master could tell you. So you could have from 3 to 18. It could vary vastly. And the kind of character you play with race and class, you'd most likely choose, depending on what you roll. It kind of restricts you a little bit. Now, next they also give the option of rolling 3d6 twice, and then choosing whichever one you want and putting it in. So I could roll a 5 and a 10 per strength, and I'd be like, I'd rather have the 10. That's what it would be on 3d6. Next they had roll 3d6 and assign them how you want. Again, that's better. I mean, I can put my good rolls where I want to be for whatever class I want, but you're still probably going to have some very tanky scores because you're going to have some low stuff. The fourth method was roll 3d6 12 times, get rid of 6 of those numbers, and then take the remaining 6 and arrange them. That's not a bad system. It still can have some low numbers, especially if you roll a lot of low numbers in 3d6. It can happen. You have to remember, 10 is the average on 3d6, so you can roll 10 very easily, and you could have all average numbers with those 12 sets of 3d6. The next one was rolling 4d6, taking the lowest number away, and then assigning them however you want. That one's not bad either, and that's a system that actually held over. It's very similar to the system that was used in 3rd edition. So this you can see is the basis of it in this 2nd edition of AD&D. And the last they gave was, you start with 8 in all 6 of your numbers. You roll 7 d6s, so you have 7 numbers, and you add them into your 8s. So if I rolled a bunch of 6s, I could have some high numbers, but you can't go above 18. You could assign higher numbers, but you never go above 18. So I could put 2 6s into my 8 here, but it's not going to give me a 20, it's going to give me an 18. So the thing about the book, which I will show you it here, this is my edition of it. This is the 2nd edition of AD&D. It's in actually very good condition, surprisingly, for a lot of my books. Probably because I didn't play it as much as I played the other systems. That's a sign of how much you played a system, is how much your book gets beat up. Of course, you could always treat your book very well, and that does happen. But as someone who's often lended out their books to people to use, it's gotten beat up. Anyway, back to the ability scores. In that book, they have charts for every ability score. It's all the same ones that we talked about in Pathfinder and 5th edition. It's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. They have been around as the 6 ability scores for Dungeons & Dragons since 1st edition. Every edition has had those 6. It's actually really cool that they kept that the same. So anyway, as I'm talking about the charts, they tell you what the ability scores do and sort of numbers associated with them. Like strength tells you if you get numbers to adjust your hits. And if you have numbers to adjust your damage, how much you can carry, how much you can bench press, chances of like quickly opening a door or bending locks. You give percentages for bending bars and lifting gates. It's actually percentages based on your strength. It's really weird that they have these sort of combinations like this, and they're very different from the editions we're talking about. And I'll try to break down these numbers a little better so you can understand them. But you have to think about it, is that traditionally most of the average around 10 ability scores will not give you adjustments to hits, and up around like an 18 will actually give you an adjustment to hit. Same with damage. You know, the very low numbers and the very high numbers will start giving adjustment. Everything else is normal in the middle, at least for the attacks and damage, for strength. And the weight limit is sort of, you'd have to look at the chart, and I'll try to put up one here if I can find it. Same for all the other stuff. Dexterity. Dexterity gives you your reaction. It's like a version of initiative, except it's like when you react to things, when you need it, it gives you a bonus to it. It gives you a bonus to melee, missile attacks they call it, which was their version of range attacks. So it's like reactions, bonus against surprises. It's a good way of saying it, actually. Bonus against surprises, missile attacks, and then also bonuses to defense. That was what Dex would give. Con, of course, gave hit points. It also gave you a bonus called System Shock, where certain things make you have to make a System Shock. It's a percentage. A percentage to successfully be resurrected, you actually had to check a percentage. And also gave you resistances to poison, possibly with very high cons. And at cons, which are normally not attained by player characters, you actually got regeneration. You could regenerate your wounds. It's really cool. So intelligence, depending on the chart, depends on how many languages you had. Depends on your percentage for learning a new spell, how many spells you sort of get. These are more like wizard spells and stuff. Also the maximum number of spells you can have, depends on your intelligence, maximum level of them, how many spells you can have per level, and it also gives you some immunities to like illusion spells, because you're smart enough to see through illusions automatically to a degree. Then we have Wisdom. Wisdom gives you sort of like a magical defense bonus. It gives you bonus spells also. It gives you spell immunity to certain spells that list off, and it also gives you a higher percentage of avoiding spell failure. Yes, there's like a percentage chances of spell failures in different circumstances. Wisdom based on your percentage for that. Whew. Charisma? Charisma was used more limited than the other editions of Dungeons & Dragons. I think it wasn't until 3rd that charisma really became a score which was more important. Because at this point it only gave you the max number of followers you could have, how loyal they would be to you, and it did give you a number bonus to social situations when you're talking with people, but the bonus wasn't particularly high, and you'd have to have a very high charisma for it to really matter. Otherwise it was pretty average. So, sort of like charisma was there, and it existed, but certain classes used it more than others, but without those classes, it just wasn't as important. It didn't come up as much as it does in other systems. You didn't have to use to make so much diplomacy checks as what you said, that sort of thing. Alright, so that's a little basics of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I've talked a little bit about making a character in it, about what the ability scores in that system meant, and we can see there's these little artifacts and little fossils of what will become the later editions, and it's always cool to go back and look at these old editions and learn from them. And I wanted to use Dungeons & Dragons to start out with because it is the original system. So okay guys, thank you for watching. Please comment, like the video, subscribe. We're always looking for more citizens to join the Empire. And until next time, I bid you farewell.